Well, Herle Burly-ites, it's time for a housing update. Almost a year ago, the federal government said it got serious about this issue, undertook a flurry of announcements. Provinces all have plans to build more homes. Interest rates are now falling. We're going to check in with our housing experts, Butler and Mike Moffatt, to see if there's any progress. Dr. Moffatt, a year ago, was meeting with the federal cabinet to give them ideas for solving housing affordability. He's currently the Senior Director of Policy and Innovation at the Smart Prosperity Institute and an assistant professor in the Business, Economics and Public Policy group at Ivey Business School at Western University. Ron Butler is the owner of Butler Mortgage, one of Canada's leading mortgage brokerages, an expert in both the market and the financing of home sales, and a prominent commentator on housing issues on social media. He has his own podcast, The Angry Mortgage. Check it out. Great to see you, gentlemen. How are you doing?
Great, David. Good to be here.
Yeah, it sounds pro forma, Ron. Really sounds pro forma. How are you doing?
Pretty pro forma. Yeah. If you bathe in the water of housing desperation like I do every day, it's hard to get excited.
Mike, are you having a good summer? Can we at least start with that?
Well, I'm having a better summer than the Blue Jays, and 4 months ago that would have sounded awesome. But right. Otherwise, no complaints.
Yeah, better than the Blue Jays, better than Trudeau. You're listing off all the people with bad summers that you're having So let's start this conversation by situating ourselves. Mike, in the year since that federal cabinet meeting, has housing affordability improved or worsened in Canada?
I'd say it's worsened overall, particularly on the rental side. We're still seeing rents go up 7 to 9% a year. You know, there are some bright spots. Rents had been going up a lot in college towns, particularly ones attracting a lot of international students. That seems to be weakening. And in fact, rents are down in some markets. There are some exceptions, like Guelph, where things are still completely out of hand. But overall, it's, house prices are still high, rents are still high. And a point that you often make is that even if price growth is still slowing, still means prices are higher than they were last year.
Right. What are you seeing on the ground, Ron?
We see growing concerns in the Toronto condo market, that there are possibly a looming catastrophe in that particular segment of investor-driven condominium purchases that are coming on stream over the next 18 months. Because the buildings take a long time to finish, take 5, 6, 7 years to finish.
Right.
There is a complete mismatch in pricing. People paid 5, 6 years ago significantly more per square foot than people are selling them for today on a resale basis, sometimes only like a couple of years difference in vintage. And it promises to be a unending problem for the next 18 months, that investors are pulling back, investors want to sell. The people who were investors that bought 6 years ago don't know what the hell they're going to do with the product they bought, and they might just back out on the purchases. So this is going to be something that's going to be quite difficult for the next 18 months.
But you're saying most of these people are investors. This is not their home. This Correct. Is an investment they've made?
Correct, yes.
Right? And it's turned out to be a bad investment. Explain this part to me. Have prices fallen, or have prices not risen to the extent that they expected them to be at when they bought?
A little bit of both. I mean, we are watching today prices gradually degrade in tiny condos. I've named them dog crate condos, to the great despair of a lot of people who are living in them. But that's actually degrading slightly today as we see inventory pile up to the rafters of these listings. And some of the new stuff is coming on stream at 35% higher purchase prices. So that's like an untenable problem.
Right. Okay. So there's two elements to this problem, as I understand it, from Economics 100, supply and demand. Let's deal with demand first. So the feds are now talking aggressively about scaling back temporary foreign workers and foreign students, who are most of the population growth in the country, as I understand it. How much can they do that, Mike, and how much would it help if they did?
They could do quite a bit. Now, it does take some time to turn over. That if you've got somebody who just started university, obviously they're going to be here for 4 years, right? So this doesn't sort of correct itself immediately, but this would make a huge difference. And again, those kind of college, your Londons, your Kingstons, and so on. But we should note that just recently, the Bank of Canada, in their recent monetary policy report, called into question the federal government's targets. Said that they didn't really have a plan to achieve them. Now, they put that in banker speak, but they definitely called out the federal government in a way that is.
But that's like super highly unusual. Like they must really, yeah.
It is exceptionally unusual. I can't recall ever seeing that. Normally these things are taken at arm's length, where Bank of Canada doesn't comment on federal policy, and the feds don't comment on the Bank of Canada. So that's something big going on here, where the Bank of Canada is feeling the need to call out the federal government and say, hey, you've set these targets for non-permanent residents, but we don't think we don't think they're realistic. And not only do we not think they're realistic, we're not going to use them in our models because we don't want to be wrong about our rate decisions, and we're going to be wrong if we're using these targets that simply aren't going to get hit.
Yeah. Ron, what difference would it make in the markets you watched if there were, first of all, help me understand this. I presume temporary foreign workers and students are all rentals. That's all rental market. Yeah. Nobody's buying. So it makes no difference for people that are looking to buy a home, does it?
Well, they will eventually. As Mike knows, it takes about 5 to 7 years for these people to get into some of it, if they stay. And let's face it, some of the temporary foreign workers are designed to stay. They always have been. They've always been a cadre that turns into permanent residents. To a certain extent, that's true of some international students, not the poor folks who've been conned into the community college degrees, which is just a pure ripoff. But some of the university, full-term university students did in fact remain and become permanent residents. That's how both of those areas are large draws of where we get permanent residents from, who eventually, in many cases, purchase homes. But right now, it's just about roof over the head. It's just about places to sleep. And in some ways, they're not renters like we assume renters to be. Those students, those international students, in some cases can't possibly afford, apartment rents in the GTA or even in Kitchener-Waterloo or even in London. So they are forced into living sort of stacked up like cordwood in single family homes in a lot of cases. So it created a whole divergent aspect to rental that we're not familiar with in the past. Like we didn't have people stacked up like cordwood in the basement of a house in Brampton before. That's something that's brand new.
Aren't the people who come here as students relatively wealthy? I mean, if you're going to leave another country and move to Toronto and pay the foreign rate at the U of T, you must have some money.
Sure, but the majority of that's true of those people. But the vast majority of the last 2 years, international students have been conned into 2-year to 4-year college degrees at kind of diploma mill organizations that don't even have campus size to allow the people to go and learn on campus. They're all remote learners. And again, they're stacked up like cordwood in somebody's basement.
Right.
Yeah, and we should note that, this really does affect the ownership market. That you look at a place like London, we've lost so many single detached homes and other family-sized homes to student rentals, that investors buy up these places and turn them into student rentals. At the same time, we've made it really difficult to build single detached homes because of urban growth boundaries. So we've had basically a decade where the number of homes, single detached homes and row homes available for purchase by actual families has basically had no growth in it. For every home that we're building of that type, we're probably losing 1 or 2 to an international student rental. So, I find sometimes in this discussion, we can segment these markets, but, at the end of the day, what you do in one end of the bathtub affects the entire water.
Yeah. So the immigration's taken a big load of the responsibility for this housing crisis. In fact, it's probably the single biggest reason why Canadians have turned against our immigration levels and are now thinking that we're letting too many people into Canada. But this is not a Canadian-only problem. Like the United States housing affordability is crazy too. If you can just Google it, you'll come up with an enormous number of articles about how housing's out of reach in the United States. So it can't be just our immigration policies.
Well, in the United States, it's a function of region. I don't think anybody looking for a home in Cincinnati would say that it's impossible to afford a home in Cincinnati. I mean, it's a very different country. I mean, we have been impacted, and Mike does a great job following this. Like, why would London and Kitchener-Waterloo and these sort of out of the way cities have enormous problems with price increases and rent increases? Like, there's no problem with rents in Cincinnati, Ohio. There's virtually none in Columbus. I mean, you can buy a home for $119,000 in Erie, Pennsylvania. You know, at the end of the day, there's a problem within the key provinces that are most affected by immigration, and those key provinces probably have 60% of the Canadian population in them. I'm talking about British Columbia, Alberta, and Ontario. So it's a whole different world. Yes, there's an affordability issue in the United States, but maybe just in California and maybe just in sought-after locations. But there's a lot of places in the United States that have no affordability problems whatsoever. Ask anybody in Houston, Texas.
But that's true in Canada too, isn't it?
Sure, but not everybody's moving to Fredericton. Like, Houston's a pretty big town. Fredericton isn't. So that's just the way it works.
Right. Why don't people move, Mike? I mean, you could sell your place in Toronto or Vancouver and live like a baron in Winnipeg.
Yeah, well, the funny thing is that they are, and we see this in rents, that if you look at the 6 most expensive rental markets over the last year, so that's, Toronto, Mississauga, Vancouver, they're flat. If you look at the 6 least expensive, they're up an average of 15%. That's your Saskatoons, your Edmontons, and so on. So people are doing that. So I often say, be careful what you wish for, because we are starting to see this kind of great convergence in home prices and rents. That these places that have historically been less expensive, they're starting to catch up. And that's a real problem for those communities, because, what do you do if you are a nurse in Regina, but now are having to compete with somebody who's earning a tech salary from Toronto? It just makes it that much more difficult, where you've got these home prices are getting detached from local wages.
Yeah, in Halifax, they call it the Toronto virus. But they sometimes use some other profanities, but they're definitely not happy. Nobody in Halifax is happy about it.
No, they're not happy about the money coming into their community.
They're not happy about it. It's a community that has a long history of relatively low cost rents that's being completely degraded by what's going on with. Toronto investors fly out there and buy. They not so much today, but they flew out and bought units and just tried to figure out ways to raise the rents 50%.
No, okay. So it's not unusual. I'm trying to get at expectations here in a couple of different ways, and feel free to just slap me around. But it's not unusual for people who work in major metropolitan centers to commute from another community to their job. I mean, nobody lives in Manhattan. And Toronto is the 4th largest city in North America. So how far outside of Toronto do you have to go to get something affordable?
Well, I think in fairness, you've got the problem of how are you going to get into Toronto? Like, how are you going to handle the congestion? Where has the spending been in public transit to get from just outside Toronto to even just to get to the bedroom communities like Mississauga, Burlington, Markham? Where is the public transit that's going to allow that to happen in an easy way, which is non-existent? I mean, they haven't actually finished the Crosstown LRT, and nobody knows if it'll ever be finished. They refuse to give a finish date. So we have all kinds of problems with transit, all kinds of problems with congestion, to the point where there's a movement in Toronto to try to charge a congestion fee just to come into Toronto, like London and New York. So I don't have good answers for you, because in the face of an unmanageable traffic problem and an unmanageable congestion problem, I don't know how we can suggest, and tremendous lack of transit. I don't know how you can suggest to people that they should live in Barrie and commute to Toronto.
Well, and it's not like Barrie's even affordable either, right? So, and this phenomenon has happened for a long time. Like 40 years ago, people who worked in downtown Toronto might have lived in Etobicoke, which at the time was a different city. 20 years ago, they'd go out to Mississauga or Brampton. But now, like, where do you go if you want to buy a house for 3x income? Like North Bay? Kenora,
Kingston. It's Kingston. You got to go to Kingston.
Maybe Kingston. Well, again, you're not going to London, Ontario, where home prices are about $600,000, right? Unless you've got a family income of $200,000, and not a lot of people do. So that's a challenge. It's not so much that people won't commute or things like that, but we've gotten to the point where that commuting distance and that commuting time just simply isn't realistic anymore.
Mike, just to follow up on Ron's point, how much of that is transit related versus actual distance?
Well, I think a bit of both. Yeah, absolutely. Like if we had high-speed rail or something like that, then yeah, absolutely. Somebody could live in Owen Sound and work in downtown Toronto. But, you're having to drive or take go. And, we find for a daily commuter, the average person will be willing to commute about an hour a day. So half hour each way. That's the sort of, standard there. That doesn't get you that far in the GTA, particularly with the state of our transit and state of our roads.
So is that an expectations problem? Should people, is that realistic on their part, Ron?
Well, the issue is we really have failed in such a major way. If you think back, if you're an old guy like me and you think back to Mary Tyler Moore and you think back to the Dick Van Dyke Show, there were people taking the train out from Manhattan to faraway suburbs 55 years ago. Right. So we have no such thing in Ontario. Like it simply does not exist. Okay. So there's others, when we think about these other cities, they're way ahead of us, but if I were to think about the thing that's worrying me the most today is the fact that we're building less homes in Ontario and British Columbia. We're building remarkably less homes than we were a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And that trend, let's face it, it's just plain frightening. You can't really put any other proper adjective on it.
Labs and incubators. There was a time when these words were pretty much the sole province of the medical and scientific communities. Fast forward a couple of generations, and they now apply more broadly in business and creative spaces. We don't just come up with ideas anymore. We incubate them, right? We do collabs in idea labs. That's a segue that lands me at the front door of our presenting sponsor TELUS's 5G lab in Quebec. Part of the summer of fascinating and very useful tech we've been talking about here. The TELUS 5G lab was developed in partnership with Guy Laliberté's Zoo incubator. Its purpose? Helping young Quebec businesses innovate and rapidly develop their technological proofs of concept to grow faster. What equipment will you find there? Well, it's a far cry from beakers and Bunsen burners. This is a state-of-the-art space for creation, testing, and experimentation with the latest 5G connectivity. Various editing and immersive content production rooms, and more of the digital tools these startups need to develop their ideas. Just one success story. A Quebec company called Phenomena hosted the world's first ever virtual reality e-sport arena tournament in 2022. It was a huge thing. Even huger, support from TELUS and Zoo helped Phenomena expand to 22 countries and over 70 locations, making the company and Montreal global leaders in free roam virtual reality. And that's sort of the point, eh? The 5G lab contributes to the city's rep as a hub of creativity and innovation and supports its economic vitality. It's a key piece of TELUS's broader $10 billion investment to expand and enhance network infrastructure and operations in Quebec, which has the very real effect of driving technology and growth in critical sectors like mining, public safety, telecommunications, defense, and transportation. More next week. All right, got a couple more demand questions before we get into those tricky supply matters. And I just have to get this on the table. And anybody who's young is going to freak out. but everybody my age kind of mutters about this. And I don't want to go all avocado toast and lattes on you, but are current first-time home buyers' expectations of what they're supposed to get too high? Most of the people I grew up with had pretty modest places as their first home. Is there a different expectation among the current generation?
Look,
I'd say.
Go ahead, Mike. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, well, I'd say that their expectations are a little bit different because we don't build the homes of 40, 50 years ago. You can't go out and buy a 900 square foot single detached home. Right, it's just it's a product that doesn't exist, and anything of that type is probably being torn down and replaced with a McMansion. So I think these folks aren't even looking for that anymore. And I think if anything, they've kind of downgraded their expectations to hoping to get 500 or 600 square foot condo. But you look at the proportion of people who live with their parents until their early 30s is absolutely skyrocketed, particularly in Southern Ontario. So I think they'd be happy to take anything. And yes, I do think that people aren't looking for 900 square foot single detached homes anymore, but just literally because that product doesn't exist.
Well, if a 900 square foot townhome costs $1.2 million or $1 million, then you start to go back and study the multiple of income that represents. There's just no question that the young people today are incredibly more screwed than boomers of 40 years ago. I mean, it's just math. It's inescapable. It's factual. And, all those young people who are mad at boomers are probably just right. They're just correct in their thinking.
Yeah, and thank you for leaving Gen X out of this because we benefited a lot too. And again, this is a point I often use. I bought my wife and I bought our first home. I was 27 years old, and it cost $168,000 20 years ago.
Where was it?
You're not going to London, Ontario.
Right.
And now it would be roughly about the 650 to 700 range. Right. There's not, if I was 27 years old living in London, Ontario, I'm not buying a $700,000 home. There would be no way I would be ever able to even afford the down payment. So, yeah, things are much worse for that generation than they were for the boomers or, us Gen Xers. And
there's not low cost options they're overlooking because they're beneath them.
No, not at all.
No,
not at all. If a townhouse is $1.1 million in the farthest reaches of Burlington, that's not anybody overlooking anything. I mean, that just is what it is.
Right. Okay. So, given these prices, and maybe Ron, I'll look to you to start this. Is there any different way to structure the financing of homes? Restructure the way mortgages are set up that would allow people to manage these larger prices?
Well, at the end of the day, the interest is the interest. When the federal government developed the 30-year amortization on CMHC mortgages, which is fine, it's absolutely fine. It's for an incredibly small number of people. But the response from even people who look at it, young people look at it, because people who are buying a home and making a down payment are relatively serious people. And they do understand that they're adding an incredible amount of interest to their payment structure. I mean, it's going to go on for a longer time. Even if they could afford to pay extra, it's still more interest. And we get that feedback from consumers that, won't 30 years just make it a lot more expensive for me in the end? So ultimately, everything circles back to price. When price is far too high, it's an almost inescapable problem, because any kind of financing methodology to try to ameliorate that issue or make it easier for people to get into the first home, it ends up sort of supporting demand and not necessarily creating any motivation for prices to reduce or even stabilize. I mean, we have seen some price reduction from the incredible insanity of 2021 in the GTA and in the Lower Mainland, but quite frankly, it hasn't come down anywhere enough to start to support anything approaching a normal income to price ratio.
I thought I read that 80% of houses in Toronto were selling below asking.
It's about right. Yeah. It's about right.
So that must indicate some softening in price.
There's absolutely softening in price, but if we look at the run up in price since 2018, it's over double in the GTA. So if you've got an over double and you come off 10%, it's still incredibly expensive.
Right. What's the bigger problem here for young people buying a first home? Is it the down payment or the monthly payments?
Both. Absolutely both.
I mean, the down payment the reason I ask is because to me, the down payment seems really daunting. Like if you're 27 years old, where are you supposed to find $150,000? Right.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I worry about the more sort of macro societal impacts of that, right? That, we're going towards more and more of a society where it depends who your parents are. Right, because that's where people are getting their down payment, right? So this affects things like socioeconomic mobility, right? That it doesn't, if you're born to the wrong parents who don't have enough money, you really can't climb up the ladder, right? Because those first initial steps have been taken away from you. So I think this is going to have large societal impacts, where again, your success in life is more determined by who your parents are than anything that you do.
Yeah, no, it's very stratifying, for sure.
It's a new version of feudalism. That's correct.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk a little bit about supply then. All the tools seem to be at the municipal level. Why does the federal government bear the brunt of the responsibility for this problem, Mike?
Well, I think in part because they campaigned on it. They campaigned that they were going to lower prices, that they were going to create affordability, and this goes back to 2015, and people listen to that. I do think obviously that they have a big impact on that demand side. They control population growth. They do control some of the levers, like tax policy, the GST, and so on. There's the Bank of Canada, though, that operates arm's length. But you're absolutely right that a lot of these policy tools and policy instruments are either municipal or provincial. And yeah, I do think at times we've particularly allowed provinces to skate on this, where the federal government gets a lot of the blame, and the provinces just kind of sit there and be quiet and let the feds get their heads kicked in.
Right. So what's going on at the provincial level, Ron? Like, let's take Ontario. So the Ford government talks about housing a lot. They say they are committed to building more housing. And why wouldn't they be? Like, I take them at face value. I'm not saying they're hypocrites. I presume they would like this to happen. But it is not happening, right? Like, new construction, as you said, is down, not up. So the feds have put in place all these incentives to the municipalities to get things right. The province has a housing plan and a housing goal, which we're not going to hit not half of. So what's going on?
Well, unfortunately, Premier Ford stepped in a huge steaming pile of dog dew when he tried to do something with the Greenbelt, and he's had to back away 100% from it. So if that's the case, if you have this artificial land control that prevents satellite cities, and we haven't even touched on the inability to create adequate infrastructure to get a highway going to where people should probably be. It's becoming it's incredibly hard. I mean, you talk about it on your podcast all the time, David, that we've been talking about a highway to the Ring of Fire for about 25 years. They haven't even approved one yet. Right. So we have this enormous infrastructure problems that we can't escape from. And now that the Green Belt is back to being sacrosanct and a kind of a form of religion, we can't seem to be able to make any progress on that either. So we've got a constraint on where you can build. We've got enormous difficulty in how you can build. If you go back to when we were building tons of homes in the late 70s, early 80s, there was about 2 reports you needed to get the subdivision built. You needed basically land table and where you're going to put the roads and the parks, that kind of thing. You're done. There's 20 different reports that you need to create before you submit an application to build 160 homes in a new subdivision. So it's almost unmanageable what you have to do to get that done. And of course, we've changed the nature. Canadians probably still think, well, we need to build more homes. They think about, oh, where's the price of lumber? In the GTA, the price of lumber is almost effectively meaningless. We build 80% of the buildings in the GTA are based on concrete slabs and high rises. So maybe we should think about, why is the price of concrete so high? Why is the price of slab so high? Is it possible there's only 3 major suppliers for the entire province? Is that a possibility? And it just goes on from there. We haven't even touched on the municipalities who have ramped up. The sort of the response to the Housing Accelerator Fund, which most people would agree is probably a pretty good idea, was that, okay, if we're going to authorize more developments on single-family lots, we're going to authorize 4-plexes, 6-plexes on single-family lots. That's great, and the City of Toronto did that, and then almost instantaneously, they found ways to increase development costs, and they noticed that the complaint process about how you go about that construction just escalated off the charts too. So it's become very difficult to do.
Of course, now, Mike, I'm not a guy that naturally thinks that a regulation is a bad idea. I'm not somebody that hears what Ron said and instinctively says that 22 is worse than 2, sorry. And so, but what is the reality here? Is this a lot of bureaucracy for no purpose, or are we actually building safer homes, building more normal communities, whatever?
Yeah, well, I think in some senses that yes, I mean, they're not completely useless, and we are doing things to protect land better, make sure that we're not building on floodplains and things like that. So these do have uses, but it tends to be additive, right? And it's very rare for these things to get taken away or streamlined. But I think we're asking the right questions here about, why is it so expensive? And again, let's go back to the home I bought in London, Ontario, 2004, $168,000. About $5,000 of that was development charges, like Ron pointed out. Another $20,000 was the land cost. So that's about $25,000, and then about $140,000 was everything else. Well, today the development charges in London are $47,000. They've gone up almost 10x. In the last 20 years. And land cost for that little tiny postage stamp piece of property I bought is now about $200,000. It's also gone up 10x, right? And a lot of that is due to some really problematic land use policies that don't really let you build up, and they don't really let you build out. So land has become really scarce. Well, now, before I even buy a piece of lumber or drywall, get one piece of, shovel in the ground, I'm already at $247,000 plus all the legal fees and everything else that Ron points out on these 22 studies. Lumber could be free, concrete could be free, but if development charges and land prices are absolutely through the roof, you're never going to get any kind of affordability.
Well, do either of you know the answer to are the development charges cost recovery, or are they a revenue source for the municipalities? Are they supplementing their general revenue with these charges because they don't have other streams of revenue they can access, and so this is one and they choose it? Or are they just finally recovering actually what the cost is of providing service to these things?
Yeah, so I can take it.
Go ahead, Mike. Go ahead.
Yeah, so it goes into a separate account, and it's all it's all done by provincial law. So it's not so much cost recovery, but because they get the money up front, right? It's more, okay, what are the sort of future expenses going to be for the subdivision or for these buildings and so on. And it's supposed to be this kind of framework of growth pays for growth. Like, these are only things that we absolutely have to do because we're building more homes. If we're not building more homes, we wouldn't do them. But it's hard to know what those things are. So municipalities have all the incentive to pack everything in there, call everything growth. So, they could be replacing a 80-year-old water treatment plant with a new one, kind of claim like, oh, well, we wouldn't be doing this unless, a new subdivision. So we could put all of that onto development charges, none of it onto property taxes. We see the city of Kitchener, for example, is building a brand new, like $124 million FIFA soccer complex and putting almost all of it onto development charges, to the point of what one city councilor was saying, like, isn't this great? We're getting this great new facility and it's not costing the taxpayers a dime. So this is the ethos of municipalities, and municipalities will argue like, well, hey, this has to go through the province. They let us do this. It's in accordance to provincial rules. Which again is true, but I think those rules themselves are the problem, that they allow municipalities to throw everything in the kitchen sink into development charges, which raises the cost of housing. And for existing homeowners, it actually raises the price of our houses because it creates a price floor. So it's hugely problematic.
Yeah, if you think about the idea of building a high-rise condo in the GTA. Like, was there really is there a new street? Were there any new streets? Were there any new parks? Were there any new anything? Yes, there was some additional sewer and water required. 100% true. The power takes care of itself because people pay that bill themselves, or the condo corp does. So in the end, what exactly did all the money go for? Like, where did this, if you look at downtown Toronto, probably $100,000 of a micro condo is going into development fees. Like, where in the world was that money spent? Like, look, in reality, it goes to general revenue. If you hired a forensic accountant to say how much money was actually spent to actually support the building of that condo, to increase the water supply, to deal with the sewer issues, whatever you want to call it, that forensic accountant would say, yeah, it's about 7 or 8% of this fee. I mean, 92% is going somewhere else.
So, okay, then Mike, why doesn't this conversation take a step back and say municipalities are strapped for cash and they're looking for cash any way they can get it? So they're screwing the housing market. Why don't we give them some other source of revenue so that they can back off on development charges?
Yeah, I think we should do that. And I think, again, we should get kind of forensic here about where this money is going from. And, I think we could put it into three buckets. One is, the sort of the FIFA soccer stadium and all these kind of nice to haves. They should be funded somewhere else. And, if the entire community is going to use them, I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that they should go onto property taxes or something else. Another one is roads, that it goes to roads and other forms of transit. So there, you can look at any number of things like gas taxes, congestion fees, having, higher fees on the LRT or not having cost overruns. But a big one is actually on water and wastewater, that municipalities fund water and wastewater infrastructure in a way that they don't on hydro and electricity infrastructure, like Ron points out. There is a model that we can use in other communities. Some communities like Edmonton use this, where you make the water and wastewater actually a separate municipal utility. And then you can charge the users of that water and wastewater like a hookup fee and things like that. And you can kind of amortize it over their bill over 30 years. So you just charge people a little bit each month instead of this massive upfront cost. Because right now we're paying billions of dollars more in interest costs on this infrastructure because we're making homeowners pay for it at mortgage rates. If we finance this infrastructure at government borrowing rates, we would, collectively save billions. So it's not just about who pays for this infrastructure, but it's also about how we finance this infrastructure and what it's costing all of us.
I want to talk for a minute about an unsexy, plain brown, unprepossessing thing that nonetheless possesses iconic status in the Canadian institutional memory. I'm talking about the railroad boxcar. We've all seen them at some point, usually so many bolted together behind a locomotive that you can't see the end of the train. Every kid on the prairies, and quite a few elsewhere in Canada, has squirmed in the back seat of the family sedan at a rail crossing, watching a solid wall of those rectangular brown cuboids, yes, that's the geometric term, clicking by for what seemed like forever. Boxcars have looked basically the same for nearly 200 years. That timelessness has made them famous. Bandits chased them in westerns. Hobos jumped onto them in the 30s. Stuntmen leaped out of their sliding doors in movies, and over the decades, they transported just about everything, everywhere. Our sponsor, CN, operated wooden boxcars during the company's early years, 30,000 of them at one point. They were eventually ruled fire hazards and phased out. In the 50s, the railway began using steel boxcars. One particular fleet was nicknamed Buffalo Cars because of the Manitoba buffalo image each one displayed. The arrival of specialized hopper cars in the second half of the last century removed the grain mission from boxcars, but they remain in use for just about everything else. Modern boxcars are bigger and more sophisticated, often refrigerated or cushioned. A few years ago, CN ordered 800 new ones, 60 feet long, high capacity, and yes, still brown. It might seem a little counterintuitive to be spending millions expanding capacity like that in a period of economic uncertainty. But CN believes that constant reinvestment in the railroad, regardless of the economic cycle, is wise. The boxcars were needed for forest products and metals and minerals and auto parts and bagged agricultural products and on and on and on. Because as I've said here a few times, cargo has to move, and boxcars just keep rolling. So the two of you have been watching this. Try to explain this to me. I have to believe that all of the governments are acting in good faith within the constraints that they're in, because they all have an incentive to solve this problem, and certainly not to have this problem worsen on their watch. So what is preventing these levels of government from sorting this out to the extent that it is sortable?
Well, I think that it's fair to say on the municipal level, which is an incredibly important level in large cities across Canada, on the municipal level, there's no incentive to fix it. So not really, if you think about it, not really. Who elects councillors? Who elects mayors? It is a small group. It's like 18% of the voters who are typically old as hell like me. And they're the voters, and they don't want any density, and they don't want any change in their neighborhood. They're the ultimate NIMBYs, and councillors understand that, and they don't stand in the way. So until we address this fundamental flaw in municipalities and big cities actually standing in the way of some of these rational programs and trying to get things going, I don't know what the solution is. I'm seriously saying I don't know what the solution is. I mean, in the province of Ontario, we had a big push in the last budget to increase, to Mike's point, water treatment plants. There was a ton of money set aside for water treatment because it turns out in some small towns and cities who would like to expand their population, they could only put in another 200 toilets and they were done. They couldn't handle anything more. So, how does that happen? Like, seriously, how does that happen in the face of astronomical immigration? And the immigration's been coming for a while. I mean, the 500,000 target was put up like several years ago. Yeah. And you can't even grow your town because there's not enough ways to process the poop. I mean, that is a very, very serious problem in reality if you're a small town that would actually like to expand.
Yeah, and I'd add to
poop
that.
Poop is such a soft word for this podcast. Right.
Well, yeah, no, I'd absolutely agree. I was doing some work with a municipality near Ottawa. That same thing, saying look, we'd love to expand, but we'd have to expand our water treatment plant, and we're a community of a few thousand people. We just don't have the money, and we can't kind of get it up front. So this is an area where we're having like a regional water authority would be exceptionally helpful. But look at Ontario. We have 444 municipalities in this province, and most of them, it actually really doesn't matter what they do. So let's say you're even a mid-sized one. Let's take Brantford. Brantford could get as aggressive as it wants in creating more housing, better housing, et cetera. All it's going to get is more people moving in from Toronto. Brantford's never going to be able to solve the Brantford problem, right? Of the 444 municipalities we have in Ontario, maybe 2 can really kind of move the needle, and that's the city of Toronto, city of Ottawa. Everywhere else is dealing with this kind of spillover demand. So then, you need those changes from the province if municipalities don't do that. And Ontario's really put itself in a corner where you've got a government that really doesn't want to build up in suburban neighborhoods, doesn't want to build fourplexes and things like that because they worry about NIMBYism and those things Ron mentioned. And they can't really build out because they've been burned by the Greenbelt scandal, or burned themselves by the Greenbelt scandal and urban growth boundaries and things like that. So the province has put itself in a corner. They can't build up, they can't build out. And then the federal government only has so many policy tools. And most of what they can do to be really meaningful on housing is more on the demand side than the supply side.
You sound so fatalistic, but to me it looks like just a fucking massive policy failure. That we have an acknowledged crisis that all levels of government acknowledge, and that we are still building about the same number of homes this year as were built in 1975 in Canada, when Canada was half the size it is today. That doesn't make any sense.
Well, look, at a certain point, supply is complex, difficult, and has a lot of layers, but demand isn't. So can we at least freeze immigration? Can we at least say, as much as Canada is devoted to immigration, we must severely restrict it for a period of 2 or 3 years so we can at least attempt to catch up? I mean, that's a simple thing. That's not a hard thing. It may be hard from a political point of view, but it's not hard to do. As Mike alluded to earlier, eventually cutting back the amount of temporary workers, eventually cutting back some pressure off demand. It just has to. But if we don't do it, we got a problem on our hands. What's going on with international temporary workers is like, some of it's just off the charts. I mean, we're talking about difficulties with fraud, about employers going ahead and essentially putting people into some sort of kind of a strange form of indentured servant with some of these situations. And we're importing people to work in fast food restaurants when I don't know why are we doing that? Like, I mean, sure, there might have been a problem right after COVID, but I don't think there's any problem right now. So why can't we just do an extreme temporary change and say we are going to dramatically reduce immigration to get to the point where we can try to catch up a little?
Mike, do you know why we can't build more houses than we built in 1975?
Well, I actually think there's a meta problem here, and it's maybe a better question for Dan Gardner, who I know you've had on. We can't really build anything anymore, and I actually but it's true, and I actually think sometimes we miss that in the housing debate, where we get so focused on can we build this or can we build that. But I actually think a lot of our problems in building are more of a meta problem. Like why don't we have high speed rail, or why don't we have large electricity interconnects between Ontario and Manitoba and Quebec and all of these things? Why don't we have that road to the Ring of Fire? It's just that we suck at building stuff. We put everything in so much red tape, so much debate. And then when we actually do get around to building it, like the Ottawa LRT, we find a way to futz it up. So I think there's a larger meta conversation about how can we build things again? How can we get anything from nuclear power plants to building offshore wind in Lake Ontario? That's the meta problem, and I think it transcends housing.
What about pay? So I keep reading about how we don't have enough people to build houses, don't have enough workers, aging workforce in the construction industry and all that kind of stuff. So I did a quick Google scan, and it turns out that driving an Uber in Toronto probably pays about $5,000 a year less than being a laborer on a construction site. So it's pretty obvious you'd rather drive a car all day than swing a hammer all day on a site. Why don't we pay those people more?
Well, I think you're going to find that question is going to answer itself in Ontario in the next 18 months. I mean, there's going to be a huge surplus of construction workers looking for a job in Ontario in the next 18 months.
Why?
Why? Because there's nobody. We've stopped building in Ontario. We have. Like, I'm dead serious, and Mike will agree. Mike's run a lot of good stuff.
Like all together, like it's like not just
yes,
that.
Like all together stop.
Together.
Yes, that's correct. Okay. It's just come to an end. Mike puts out a lot of good reports on this. It just stopped. I mean, and by the way, CMHC was running a great program that actually encouraged purpose-built rentals. What could be better than purpose-built rentals? I mean, it's got to be. And by the way, at no real government expense, it was just supplementing loan to values, amortization, and finding low-cost financing. So naturally, 3 months ago, they changed the program so it wouldn't work in Ontario and British Columbia anymore. So we won't even have purpose-built rentals being developed, which kind of saved a little bit of, believe me, housing starts in Ontario would have been much worse if we hadn't had purpose-built rentals for the last year and a half. So we're facing a completely decimated construction industry in Ontario in the next 18 months. That's just the way it's going to be.
Yeah, we're seeing layoffs, roofers, drywallers, what have you. We brought in 1.3 million people. I think a couple of them could probably swing a hammer. So, I don't think that's the issue there. I do think if we somehow ramped up housing, eventually we might run into a labor constraint, but that's the least of our worries right now. We're going to have so many layoffs in the construction sector, like Richard Lyle and others have talked about this, and we're already seeing it.
Man, I still don't feel that I have a complete handle on the dynamic on prices, though, because if you're talking about homes that over the last 15 years have gone from being worth say $700,000 to being worth $2 million, which feels to me like kind of the trajectory in Toronto over that period of time. Yep. That's not temporary foreign workers and foreign students. What's driving that?
Well, scarcity. Scarcity is driving it. Because if you convert your whole construction industry in the GTA over to high-rise slab, that's what they call it, and you build nothing but microscopic condos, 450, 550 square feet, and that becomes the vast majority of your new builds, and you don't build any new low-rise housing, then scarcity of a product that people actually want is going to drive the price up. I mean, but then we have to circle back to why the heck sweet Jesus, these are expensive. These little tiny condos are crazy expensive, okay? They don't even make sense. But we've illustrated some of the reasons that they're so expensive, and the killer is that these single-family homes and low-rise homes with semis, townhomes, they're just not building any. That's it. That's the whole. So you want to know what the expensive houses, like low-rise houses, is in the GTA and other cities like London and Kitchener-Waterloo. We're hardly building any of them, and that will create scarcity.
Yeah, and I think we could see that going back to the 80s, because we have to remember, like, this is not our first housing crisis, and it's not going to be our last. And, back in the late 80s in Ontario, we saw house prices go up, and for a lot of the same factors. Like, we had a population boom, we had a really growing economy, and back then we had a baby boom. All right, where you had families having kids. It was the first wave of the millennials. So how did we solve that problem? Well, basically we paved over Peel region. We built like just a sea of single detached homes all across Peel region in Kitchener-Waterloo and London, Ontario. My parents still live in one that we moved into in 1988. But about 20 years ago, we made the decision that could never happen again. And again, for very good reasons. We go, okay, that the creation of the sea of single detached homes in Mississauga, we collectively decided as a province, like, no, that was bad. We lost so much farmland, so much sprawl, so much infrastructure that, we just can't allow that to happen again. Well, now we find ourselves in a similar situation, But we've taken that tool away from ourselves and replaced it with absolutely nothing. So we don't really have an out here other than, again, building a handful of towers, and those help, but they only get you so far. So I think that's the challenge here. If you go back every time in Ontario's history, every time we had a housing crisis, the response to it was to build a ton of single detached homes or a ton of row homes. We don't do that anymore, and we don't do that anymore because we don't have the land for it.
Well, I'll just add one note of conflict to this otherwise highly cooperative conversation. In terms of the loss of agricultural land, it's clearly true that some of us aren't missing any meals. All right, so the idea that we have to panic over the loss of agricultural land in Ontario could be entirely misplaced. Let's just accept that. I mean, there's a lot of food coming in from other parts of Canada, a lot of food that can be continued to develop. We get better and better systems of using agriculture. Like, I've just got to sort of push back a little on the idea that when the aspirational desire of the vast majority of people I talk to in the mortgage business is to own their own low-rise property, that we should absolutely make it almost an impossibility to do that. I mean, I think that is something that we're allowed to disagree on some things. So I firmly believe we could.
I don't remember the government saying when the Greenbelt issue was live and when they got caught developing the Greenbelt, which they'd promised not to do. But that's politics. Yeah. I don't remember that they argued that our housing objectives could not be met without that.
Well, but they did kind of argue, or Ford did argue what his vision was, and he's been clear that his vision is not high-rise condos.
But they didn't change their target, Mike. They didn't change their target. No,
they didn't. They haven't changed their target at all, but he gave a speech. Again, I think it was in Waterloo, where he's saying, like, his vision is that everybody would be able to own a single detached home with a white picket fence for under $500,000. Well, kind of connect the dots. That's the only way you can get there. And I do think, we need to understand the, environmental value, the value provided by nature from this farmland. But I'd even go further than Ron. Like, if we just built homes on land that's getting used to build to grow corn to make ethanol for cars, that alone, we wouldn't even have to touch the food side. I mean, that could provide it. But I think we have to have this grown-up conversation where we look 20, 30, 50 years out and go, okay, how big is this province going to be? Where is everyone going to live? And which farmland and which agricultural lands and forests and so on do we absolutely need to protect? And which ones are we willing to build on? But we haven't done that, and everybody's kind of dug into both sides. And as somebody who lives in the kind of environmental world, we've completely dug our heels in and said, no, you just can't build anywhere. There was one report that came out recently that said urban growth boundaries should not be not only rolled back, but they can't be expanded on Ontario for the next 30 years. I'm sorry, that's not realistic. Unless, we basically put immigration down to about zero. So, but we're not having those conversations. We're kind of all dug into these positions, and then coupled with the fact that, again, what the Ford government did on the Greenbelt is, RCMP is involved, and I know whenever RCMP is involved, it's not a good story.
Right. Okay. So to end, I'd just like you to go up a few thousand feet. Because we can be, at the end of this conversation, pretty confident that the goal of doubling or even more the production of new homes is not going to happen. Nor is the population going back to what it was. In fact, population increases are likely to still well outstrip home production. So where does this go? What is going to happen?
Well, to a certain extent, we're watching what's going to happen. Yeah. We're watching falling fertility rates. So Mike writes about this all the time, that there's nobody having children in 416. I mean, virtually none, except the very wealthy. Yeah. And the birth rate's could conceivably get as low as Japan and Italy, because it's just not economically rational to try to do it. And does everybody think that's a good idea? So, look. At a certain point, we need breakthroughs. We need breakthroughs in people saying, "Yeah, we got to expand outside of the green belt. Just tear it apart, redraw it all again." We got to really think about municipal development charges. Probably like something on the order of 80% less would be about right. And then we've got to take a peek at construction. I mean, like, are there really just 3 sources of concrete slab in the province of Ontario? Shouldn't maybe that be where we put some, government effort into diversifying that? I'm so far from being a socialist, it's unbelievable, but I also do remember the ideas of Teddy Roosevelt that we probably shouldn't have had trusts. We probably shouldn't have had organizations that seem to control an enormous amount of the possible land that once the Greenbelt's opened up. It was kind of miraculous. Once the Greenbelt was thought about to open up, it turns out it was only controlled by about 5 or 6 families. I mean, like, does that make any sense? Look, these are big, broad ideas that have to be addressed, but believe me, if we have another year in 2025 of 1 million people coming into Canada, of which a huge chunk of them come into Ontario, and we will have, say, 175,000 housing starts next year. I mean, it's the crisis we've been thinking about for the last few years is going to look paltry in comparison.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And where I fear this is going is that Toronto is becoming more and more like the San Francisco Bay Area, where the schools are having to provide housing for teachers because we basically erode the middle class, and we're seeing more and more young people move out of Ontario. I think we risk seeing that only escalate. Like I teach 4th-year undergraduates, and I can tell you that more and more of them tell me that they're looking to move to Alberta, or they're looking to move to the United States just because they don't think they'll ever be able to make a go of it here. And this, and these are students at a business school. These are sort of future 1%ers, and they're like, yeah, I can't afford Toronto, or I can't even afford Ottawa at this point. So yeah, I to Ron's point, I think we need a strategy, line by line by line, and going, okay, why can't we build that house for $168,000 in London, Ontario anymore? Go, okay, well, the first piece is development charges. We got to attack that. Second piece is land prices. We got to figure out what's going on with that. Ron's right. There is a lot of there's a lack of competition in the land market. Can we open that up? Then look at the construction piece and so on, but go really surgical. Go, okay, how can we drive the price of all of these things down? And again, the 2 I would start with are the land piece and the development charge piece. But I got to tell you that the cement one sounds really important too. So maybe that's number 3 on my list.
So to follow up on Mike's point, Ron, the first time I had you on this podcast and you were on with John Webster, I think it was Webster that talked about the federal government's convening capacity and how the feds needed to basically bring all the players in and sort this out. Is that how this goes down?
I think there's nothing wrong with that idea. I think that it's kind of strange that we haven't had it happen. That if there can be a deal between provinces and the feds on healthcare, I don't understand why this thing is absent of that. That doesn't make any sense to me at all. But in the end, we're going to discover that until we get a handle on these municipalities, and to Mike's point, like $200,000 for a small lot in London, Ontario, until we get a handle on this stuff, that's at the most minute level, we're not going to be able to make progress. The Affordability Fund came in, and there was all kinds of great thoughts about it, and we're going to get big, there's going to be lots of fourplexes on single-family homes, and there's not. I mean, there's just not. I mean, because they're thwarted at the local level, and I don't know how you fix that unless you really dig in, and maybe that's going to take a provincial action to say, hey, you guys can't do this anymore. If there's going to be a fourplex on this property, you're just going to allow it. And if there's 16 neighbors lodge 16 different complaints, you're going to ignore all of them. There has to be some basic change in that silliness.
Yeah. Mike, anything to finish up?
Yeah, well, I do think we should get all the housing ministers together. I do think we need that kind of deal. But this is going to be a generational problem, and I do think we have to be looking at the municipal side more, and that's going to be both carrots and sticks. That you said it earlier, and it's absolutely right. They need more money for infrastructure. They are carrying far too much of the load, but there's got to be a quid pro quo here. Saying, okay, yeah, we're going to finance this stuff. Maybe we'll take the wastewater off your hands, but you shouldn't. It shouldn't take years to get a building permit or that kind of thing. So I do think, yes, having the federal government and provinces work together, but that municipal reform piece. Without that, I don't think any of this is going to work.
Right. Terrific. Listen, guys, thanks for your wisdom and guidance this afternoon. Had a great chat. Really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, if you're looking for negativity, just search for us again.
Well, I picked the topic. And I hope you gentlemen will come back and we can update this as time goes on, because I really worry about its social implications. Really worry about it.
You're correct.
Really worry about its social implications. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a 13-year-old daughter who eventually I think she would like a place of her own. And I think we might like her to have a place of her own. So I am committed to solving this in the next 10 to 15 years. Or so.
Excellent. It's good to have that kind of a deadline. All right. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail, and all you Herle Burly-ites who watched or listened to this program. Hope you enjoyed it, learned as much as I did. And we'll see you next week with more. In the meantime, take care of yourselves.
Burly, burly.